Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me, the one true host, the good Dr. Eric Trexler. No Eric Helms today. Honestly, not a big deal. A lot of the fan mail I get suggests that it's usually our better episodes when he's not around. So I expect this one to be an absolute monster of an episode and essentially a highlight reel for the Iron Culture database and archive. So thank you for joining us. Rather than being joined by Eric Helms, I am joined by the Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. She's been on Iron Culture many times before. She is an esteemed co-author of the Mass Research Review. Lauren, how are we doing tonight?
Thank you for having me. Excited to be back.
All right. You didn't answer the question. How are you?
I'm great. I'm excited that I just realized while looking at myself that my shirt matches my plant holder behind me, and I'm into that aesthetic.
Yeah, we're both going with a kind of like Easter colored sweatshirt vibe. So we've got a bit of a matching motif here. Nice. I don't know if this is...
It's like a gender reveal party.
Yeah, I was gonna say it probably doesn't necessarily fit as pastels, but no, you're right. This is very much a, how will people ever know which of us is the boy or the girl? I'll wear a blue unlabeled sweatshirt with no hood, and you can do the same with pink. And then everything will be clear. I think it'll be better for the audience that way, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad we could do that for them. Now, Lauren, we are both involved in fitness, and we're both involved in the science of fitness. And we spend really inexplicable, unjustifiable amounts of time talking about both and how they interact. And I think one of the things that personally I find really interesting about getting into the science of fitness is that ability to kind of merge the practical and the scientific, right? So you can kind of lean on the literature when there is literature to lean on, or you can lean on your experience in the trenches. And then there's those kind of fun times where you can kind of cross-reference them and kind of talk about, does what we're seeing in the literature really reflect, the real lived experience when we're out there in the world doing fitness stuff. So tonight on this episode, I want to talk about two topics that aren't really like fitness, but are very much areas where I spend a lot of time in the trenches. And it's cool to be able to kind of cross-reference it with some scientific literature. So I've been, for many years, engaged in the fitness trenches, training, lifting stuff. But I've also been in the trenches of living life as an attractive, cool person. And so I've got a wealth of anecdotes to talk about when it comes to, what does it take to be an attractive, cool person? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How is it perceived? But finally, we have evidence here about the science of being attractive and the science of being cool, Lauren. So if it's okay with you, tonight I want to take a little walk into this literature and talk about what it means to us. And then we'll talk a little bit parlaying from being attractive and cool into matching workouts to your personality type. So kind of a meandering episode of this cluster of topics that is not the normal standard fare for Iron Culture, but is of no doubt of interest to the cult of folks who engage in the iron. It is absolutely scientifically rooted, and I think it's probably a nice middle ground between Iron Culture and Front Page Fitness. Would you agree?
Shout out our podcast, Front Page Fitness.
Yes. So I should get all the promotion out of the way right now. First of all, with with Iron Culture, if you like it, make sure you do what you got to do. Like, rate, subscribe, review, tell a friend, send it to a friend, submit questions. Go to our question portal at massresearchreview.com/ironculture. We answer those all the time on the show. Join us live when we happen to be live, usually Mondays at 7 p.m. Eastern. And then, of course, the best way to support us is to become a member of the Mass Research Review community. Learn more at massresearchreview.com. Now, for the new promotion, Lauren and I have been co-hosting yet another podcast called Front Page Fitness. It's available everywhere that you get Iron Culture. And Front Page Fitness, it's different than Iron Culture. Basically, what we do is we look at essentially terrible headlines, I would say is most of what we do. So we kind of look at what is on the front page of fitness in terms of what are the goings on. If you were to just click over to like CNN's health page. Like, what are people talking about out there? And what we would like to do is bring attention to really well-written journalistic stories that accurately reflect the science that's happening and is quite useful and robust. I would say 90% of the time what that ends up being is saying, I can't believe that this article exists, but here's what the science actually says. So it's not gossipy, right? We don't get down into the muck of the who got arrested in fitness this week. Although I wouldn't put it past us. I'm not sure we'll never get there, but so far that's not been where we exist.
But it's light, and we laugh, and we sprinkle in a little science along the way.
Exactly. Yeah. So, all right, Lauren, with that out of the way,
tell me what it takes to be attractive. Yeah.
Yes. So you're familiar with this because I wrote a mass article about this. And so I'm just going to hit the high notes here and talk about basically, what the study was all about, what they found, what it means. And then I also want to reflect a little bit about the feedback and kind of see, see if I'm crazy. Some of the feedback was fundamentally totally contradictory to what I was expecting. Yeah. So we had a study by Lauren. How would you pronounce a name that is spelled X-I-A if you were in my shoes, hypothetically?
Xia?
Xia? Yeah. So we'll go with Xia. The name of the study I feel much more confident in. It's the relationship between body fatness and physical attractiveness in males. And this is out of John Speakman's lab. John Speakman was the senior author. And if you're a longtime Iron Culture listener, I talk about John Speakman's work essentially every opportunity I get. He's done a lot of really, really cool stuff. He essentially came up with the dual intervention point theory of body weight and body fatness regulation, which essentially, I would argue, fully replaced body weight like set point theory and settling point theory. Usually when people explain set point theory and then work in a sprinkle in a little bit of settling point theory, they believe that they support both of those, but what they actually support and believe is the dual intervention point theory. They just haven't heard it verbalized that way yet. So Speakman is well known for that. He's an absolute pioneer in the world of doubly labeled water. And I can tell you, as someone who works in a doubly labeled water lab, when you don't know something, you try to figure out if John Speakman has ever talked about it. That's pretty much how you solve your problems, methodologically speaking. He's an absolute legend. So whenever he publishes something new, it always catches my attention. Oh, he also has written a bunch of really cool stuff about protein restriction as a longevity tool and caloric restriction as a longevity tool. And lest I be misinterpreted, as a longevity tool in quotes there, because protein restriction essentially doesn't work in humans to support longevity, and caloric restriction maybe could work, kind of possibly in theory, but practically speaking is pretty much a non-starter. So anyway, out of Speakman's lab, they were looking to assess how BMI, body fat percentage, and body shape would influence attractiveness ratings for male physiques. And so basically what they had was groups of people, including males and females, and they wanted them to rate these different physiques, basically saying, what do you think of this one? Pretty attractive, pretty not attractive, rate it on a rating scale quantitatively. And so there were male and female raters, and they wanted to get people from multiple different regions and cultures, so it wasn't just representative purely of the cultural influences of one place. So they got individuals from China, Lithuania, and the UK to rate these images. Now, Lauren, have you ever worked in a lab that did a lot of DEXA?
Yeah.
The Stu's lab does DEXA, right?
Mm-hmm.
What model do you remember? Were you a Hologic or a GE crew?
I believe GE.
Yeah, GE. I actually transitioned during grad school from a Hologic to a GE, and I felt like I was really moving up in life. I was really happy with the change. So anyway, when you have especially with the GE model that I was trained on, the DEXA output essentially looks like the Michelin Man. You just kind of see this like grayscale, black and white blob type image of a person's silhouette and outline as they're laying down on the table. And so the reason I bring that up is in this study, people were basically identifying quantitatively who is the most sexy Michelin man of all the Michelin men. So they were not rating actual humans like in the room. They were not rating pictures of people where you could see their eyes and face. They weren't even looking at pictures of their silhouettes. They were looking at actual DEXA scan printouts saying, this is the physique. How attractive is it out of whatever? So they did that, and essentially what they found was pretty well in line with a lot of other literature in this area, which goes along with evolutionary theory. And Lauren, as you know, I now work in an evolutionary anthropology department. Actually, I guess that appointment officially ended, so I can't say that anymore.
Well, you said it enough.
I know, but I really like to be able to claim that I'm like an evolution expert.
Right.
So I'll have to figure out what to do about that. I still work with Herman. He's awesome. I'm still doing research in the lab. I just have switched over on paper to a different department. So anyway, in the weeds. But as our resident evolution expert,
Sure.
this kind of goes along with a theory that's been crafted in that space, which is that when it comes to purely the physique portion of physical attraction, a lot of what we're drawn to is essentially signaling of fitness, not fitness in the fitness world perspective, but evolutionary fitness, right? So any kind of visual signaling that this individual would be a good mate who, can, survive a tough winter, be of use for protection from threats, perhaps gather resources that would be of utility to the community and family. The idea is, we're looking for someone who is signaling all those attributes of being, fundamentally robust and resourceful and resilient, so to speak, physiologically. So in line with that theory, conceptually, what you would expect is it probably makes sense that, you think, okay, like maybe a fairly broad-shouldered, somewhat burly, but not overly huge, probably relatively low-ish body fat, but not absolutely shredded to the point that if we had like 3 weeks of bad hunting and gathering, you're basically dead, which is like, as a bodybuilder, that's what it feels like when you're ready for a show is like, if I miss 3 meals, I might have to just like text my family, hey, I'm not going to make it. So that's pretty much what they found was that when they looked across these attractiveness ratings, generally speaking, in that like 13-14% body fat range is where they saw the peak level of rated attractiveness. And if it got way lower than that, the attractiveness rating would go down. If it got way higher than that, the attractiveness rating would go down in the aggregate. And they also had some additional findings related to essentially, kind of body shape and proportion, right? So that kind of V taper, so to speak, or shoulder to waist ratio. And generally speaking, when you look at this study and compare it to others, that's essentially what seems to poll well is, a decent V taper, but not like an IFBB pro bodybuilder, broad shoulders, slightly higher than average muscularity, low-ish body fat, but not shredded. So I basically wrote the article and said, this is pretty cool. Because, I mean, Lauren, if I did a cross section of the fitness world, let's talk male demographic 18 to 30. What body fat percentage do you think most people who like hire a fitness coach want to get to?
For men?
Yeah, for men.
Maybe 15.
15-ish? Yeah.
Like, 12.
Yeah.
But probably not below. I feel like 10 is starting to push.
Yeah. So I exist in a particular niche of fitness, being in the more bodybuilding space. It's kind of my origin story, where honestly, a lot of people, Lauren, will say like, man, I knew I hit rock bottom because I reached 14% body fat. And I looked in the mirror and just couldn't believe it. I felt sick with how far I had gotten bloated and out of shape. Like there is like a not negligible subset of the fitness community that literally starts to wonder, like, is 15%, if I get above 15% body fat, is it still possible to build muscle? Or will I be so insulin resistant that I cannot shuttle nutrients to my muscle tissue? So like,
I realize that, but then when you think about not like superhero movies, but big movies where like this is the attractive guy, this is the one that everyone wants, or he's supposed to be your epitome of the hot guy. It's never someone.
there, give me an actor.
Uh,
Not your preference, but just as a for instance.
um, I don't know. That's you're putting me on the spot. But the archetype of that is somebody who is not too big because he has to look good in a suit.
Yeah.
And if you're too jacked, you look terrible in a button-down shirt and a suit.
Oh, do not tell that to the 90s bodybuilders who drape themselves in those curtains that they call the suit. Those are classic images.
And you want some pecs, some delts, but you don't want striations, and you don't necessarily want these chiseled abs. And that is what you see in that sort of. Remember Gossip Girl?
You're never going to believe this. I have.
You have.
No, I haven't. But okay, is there someone in there?
Yeah, so he's somebody who's like your all-American looking Abercrombie kind of guy who fits that mold.
Now, would Brad Pitt in Fight Club, is that too lean, or is that within that sweet spot? Because I feel like a lot of guys that they kind of circled that and said like, "Ooh, I'd like to look that way."
Yeah, maybe a little on the leaner side, but he's an example for sure.
Yeah. Another person that comes to mind is who's the guy that plays Captain America, like maybe around that level.
Chris Evans.
Yeah, who Helms' claim to fame is that he has occasionally been confused for. But yeah, he strikes me as a guy who's like, muscular, but not like, absolutely gigantic, and lean, visible abs, but not completely etched out of stone abs.
Helms and Chris Evans look absolutely nothing alike.
Well, we're going to have engagement on this episode, so that's all we can hope for. Helms is, I think that's going to hurt him more than anything I've ever said about his age on this show. But
sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know, so I'm just coming in as a random third party. But yeah, I mean that back to the point. Yeah. I know that there's when you are deep into the lifting, not even competitive bodybuilding, but that's the sort of physiques that you're consuming online and you're around that, then you develop a very warped perspective of what is big and what is lean.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So, for instance, I remember when I was young, and I was still in that land of like making virtually linear gains. I remember thinking, at my height of like 5'7", I was like, you know what? I don't want to be overly huge. I don't want to be overly lean. I just want to have like a solid physique. So if I could just get to about 190 at 6% body fat, that's all I want. Like, it's nothing.
Reasonable expectation.
Yeah, and I'm like, in hindsight, I look back and I'm like, oh, so be like a world champion natural bodybuilder. Interesting. Yeah, that would be good. That would be nice. So, yeah, again, and that's when I was like steeped in like, I followed IFBB bodybuilding at the time. So in my view, you weren't big unless you were 5'7", 245, like that's right, where bit starts. But no, so coming from this kind of like odd little, I say odd in an endearing way. It's like I, as a wrestler, it's like an odd little community, and you're part of it, and we're different. It's not like a major sport in America. But in this odd little cross section or kind of sub niche of fitness, there's a lot of people who think that like once you get over 15% body fat, you're not only like chunky, but you're actually now of poor metabolic health.
Right.
And your metabolic health actually gets in order as you get maybe to like 10% body fat. And that's kind of like you're lean-ish. And then when you get to like 6 or 7% body fat, it's like, okay, now I will acknowledge you are shredded and you've done it. And that is kind of the standard that people aim for. And so one of the things that I found really interesting about this particular paper is like within that niche, you'd be amazed the number of people who show up and their before picture is 15% body fat. And they come to their coach and say, we got to do something about this now. We need to be, certainly above average muscularity, but we need to be like 7% body fat and have totally shredded abs. I should have visible abs in any lighting known to mankind. And specifically, the reason I'm doing that, going from a very comfortable 15% body fat to an extremely, in most cases, uncomfortable 6 or 7% body fat, is to be sexy.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that the literature shows us time and time again that if you get out of the fitness world that has its own kind of set of criteria and always gravitates toward the extremes, like I'm sure there is a set, within the fitness world, you may indeed walk around and get, some positive feedback indicating, yeah, you're looking great. But if you look at a cross section of, since it's people talking about wanting to be sexy and improve their odds in the dating pool, if you just took a cross section of the dating pool, there's actually like a number of people who would say, I think I might prefer the before picture.
Right.
And so I'm not of the opinion that, a client comes to me with a fitness goal and I say, well, no, we need to think about what an average cross section of the general population would feel about this, right? Like that is just not how I view it. But when someone tells me I want to do this very hard thing that's actually going to like temporarily jack up my endocrine profile and I'm going to be miserable when I get there, I am doing this to be sexy. I think it's worth at least saying, like, according to the literature, that's not how it works. And like maybe if you want to go from 15 to 12-ish and maybe put on a little bit of muscle and, maybe that would improve your odds in facilitating that specific goal. But yeah, what I did in my article was kind of reinforce this idea that like when you look across all these different studies at what seems to rate the highest, it kind of is anchored at that 12 or 13% body fat with boundaries ranging maybe from 10 to 16 body fat percentage. And what's unique about that not unique, but what's coincidental, I would say about that is that also tends to be a range at which you can feel pretty confident that you've maximized the cardiometabolic benefits of leanness. I know that there are people out there who worry about their cardiometabolic health when they go from 11% body fat to 16, but it's fundamentally incompatible with all the evidence on the topic.
Yeah.
And in fact, you'll find some papers where they'll say like, we wanted to see the body fat level where, mortality risk is maximally reduced. At what body fat percentage do you basically most effectively hedge your bets for living the longest, healthiest life with, lowest risk of chronic disease? In some cases in the 20s for males. Now, I think that those numbers are often skewed because what's happening is a lot of people out there in the world who are not fitness buffs, who are single digit body fat, frankly have medical conditions that are causing them to lose a lot of weight. And so that's kind of biasing, making leanness look less healthy than it actually is in the context of a fitness enthusiast. But all that is to say, you do not need to get to 8% body fat to maximize your health, your longevity, and according to research, like objective research, your perceived attractiveness to the broadest cross-section of the dating pool. And so, Lauren, I wrote that article and I thought a lot of people would kind of, frankly, have a little bit of introspection and be like, I feel like my perspective on this topic has been very distorted from kind of steeping in the fitness online space. And then after that introspection and reflection, maybe you have like a sigh of relief of like, this is great. Like if I was doing this to be maximally hot, but according to science, I can do that at a body fat level that's much more comfortable, is not going to tank my thyroid hormone and testosterone, is not going to tank my libido. Because, I mean, imagine the ultimate irony of I want to do this to improve my dating odds. And then by the time I get there, I couldn't possibly be less interested in dating, right? Like, what a tremendous irony. So yeah, I thought a lot of people would be like, oh, this is fantastic. So you're telling me I don't have to, because that's the thing, Lauren, is like, and you know this, everyone who's been around fitness and especially like studied bodybuilders knows this. The level of awfulness is so nonlinear with fat loss, right? Like if someone is at 20% body fat, it's like, how awful is it going to be to get to 15? Not at all. We can do that in a very feasible way. How awful from 15 to 10? That's considerably harder. Like, especially as we get close to 10, 10 to 7, 10 to 6 is where it gets genuinely miserable and like quite unbearable. And so the take home from this research is like, if that really is your driving force, and I'm not saying it should be, but if that is your driving force and your goal for fitness is to say, hey, I just want to do well out there on the dating pool, and, you know, feel like, you know, my perceived attractiveness is maximized, how fantastic that you can get there without having to go through the worst absolute portion of this and get to a spot where you just genuinely feel less comfortable on a day-to-day basis. And Lauren, there were some people that I think, I got DMs. I'm not like calling out anyone publicly or anything like that, but I did get some DMs from people that actually seemed a little bit upset by that information. And do you have any reflection on why that would be? Or any response to that?
Because they have worked so hard to be so lean, and so they're disappointed to hear that?
I don't know. I think there was a lot of very motivated reasoning in terms of like, no, this can't possibly be the case. Like everyone knows that
Okay.
certainly to maximize your sexiness, you have to have like totally chiseled abs out of stone in any lighting. You have to be down at 6 or 7% body fat.
Yeah, I have two comments on this. One, I know we didn't get to the cool part yet, but
Yes.
if you are doing all of the things to struggle to maintain a body fat level that low, you're not fun. You're not doing anything fun. You're not going out to eat. You're not going out for drinks. You're tied to all of your food scale and your tracking, and you are obsessively doing your steps and going to the gym, and that's not fun for dating. And sometimes you can get so obsessive with all of that that you actually start to develop kind of antisocial tendencies because all of this requires that level of diligence and commitment. So there's that. The other thing I think we do...
If I may interject,
yeah.
I do want to acknowledge a tip of the hat. There are folks out there that are extremely intentional about avoiding some of what you mentioned, like people who say, I'm a bodybuilder, but I will not let this affect the people around me. But Lauren, to your point, it is so intentional. Like it is such an uphill battle to say, I am not going to do those things and let them impact the people around me. The success rate is very low, and that's among people who make it their absolute top priority. So you're completely right, but I did want to acknowledge that like there are people who try to not be that, but it's that's a hard fight.
Yeah, I mean, because it gets to a point where you're the one bringing your salad to the barbecue.
Yeah, absolutely. Cut you off. What was the second point?
Well, yeah. So the second thing is, I think not to get too stereotypical, but I think when we kind of look historically at what men think is attractive in themselves or in other men, and then we do the same thing in women, and we see, okay, the men are looking at these, you know, really shredded bodybuilders, athletes, whatever, and then the women are looking at these stick thin models in magazines, or these people who've had a tremendous amount of plastic surgery to look like that, and then we start getting whatever version of an unrealistic body type for everybody, or an unachievable body type for a lot of people without a ton of work, a ton of money, or, you know, entirely changing your structure. Then what we actually see is there's not a lot of crossover, because the men don't find that like as thin as humanly possible physique very attractive on women. And so it's women like looking at these other women and trying to be as thin as humanly possible. But the men are like, ugh, that's too much. That's too skinny. I don't find that attractive. And then the men are saying, oh, I want to be as jacked as humanly possible. I want to look like a superhero. And the women are like, whoa, slow your roll. That's too much. So it's sort of funny that we're all doing this because it's what we perceive as attractive, but then the opposite sex isn't even finding it attractive.
Yeah. No, it's really fascinating. And like there's some interesting research going back to like tracking toys over time, right? So like G.I. Joe back in the 60s just looked like a dude. It looked like, pun intended, an average Joe. He just had a military uniform and we knew he was a hero, right? And then all of a sudden you look at like action figures as they progress, and we go through that period where like literally the average lean body mass, like the average lineup of a movie in the 1980s, like all the men were like 215 or 230 and like 7% body fat. Like it was essentially a bodybuilding show set to a plot. That was like the peak 80s, and all the action figures became like just proportions that if you scale them to human size are literally IFBB pros aren't even touching some of those proportions in terms of like arm to waist or chest to waist. And then a similar thing with dolls for that girls would predominantly play with, right? So they would find these like BMIs that were like 13 on the Barbie doll. They're like, oh God, we probably shouldn't be like doing that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you look at there are Barbies that my grandma had, and she saved them. They're like OG Barbies, and they look like normal body proportions and compositions. And then like Barbie became, I think, in human scale, it's like you'd have to be 7 feet tall and have several ribs removed to actually achieve that.
Yeah. So like you're saying, I think there's a lot of this reinforcement of these standards that are both fairly unrealistic, or in some cases just when it comes to the action figures, just fundamentally not a real thing human bodies do.
Right.
But then it kind of reinforces these ideals or goals that aren't necessarily reflective of the feedback we get out in the real world in terms of who's dating who and what kind of looks are really being idealized publicly as being highly attractive. So it's really, really fascinating stuff to think about, like how we got to that point. But certainly it's true. And to be totally honest, I think one of the things I've noticed with some of the pushback, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, and we can move on to being cool, because you don't want to just be attractive. You want to be attractive and cool, right?
That's right.
So it kind of gave me a little bit of the vibes of like, people in like a lot of fitness enthusiasts kind of suggested, I don't want to be too dismissive, they suggested for many years that they wanted the world to get fitter and leaner, and for people with higher BMIs to achieve lower BMIs. Like this is a good thing. This is a net positive thing that people should be striving for. And then effective medications came by that could facilitate that. And they're like, wait. No, not that way. Like, I do think that there's a segment of the fitness world that the difficult and rare is the purpose. You know what I mean? Like it's like if you could just be 6 or 7% body fat and have it not suck, that doesn't count. Like it has to suck. It has to be hard. It has to be hard to attain. And it's almost like a precious metal. It's like the rarity and what you have to go through to mine it is what makes it special and useful and good.
And if you're cheating, then how dare you?
Exactly. And
quote unquote.
I think for a lot of people, they're like, no, there's no way that taking a non-maximalist approach to leanness could possibly be optimal in terms of these appearance, attractiveness ratings. Like it has to be that the pain and the gain are correlated linearly. There cannot be a ceiling effect in that regard. And so I think there is some bias there where it's like, the harder thing has to have higher payoff. It must, because I've built my whole life and mindset around that. You know what I mean? So I think there is a little bit of that going on in terms of the pushback of saying like, no, like it looks like you can actually be considered like peak attractive at like 13% body fat. I think for some people that just kind of conflicts with a lot of mental narratives that they've been building for many, many, many years, and takes a lot to unravel. Now, Lauren, the last thing I'll mention on attractiveness is, before we get all bent out of shape about this, body shape is one factor of many that goes into, if you all the literature I've talked about has been focused purely on study designs that focus on body shape, which is really just one factor of many that goes into, like, there's a whole other bodies of literature where they do like a multiple factor assessment of attractiveness or perceived attractiveness, where they say, okay, we're going to do body shape, but also facial structure and symmetry and personality type, and are you funny, and are you confident, and all these other things, right? So the last thing I'll mention when it comes to this research on attractiveness is, folks, you can't just get jacked and say like, well, that'll solve all my problems. I'm having a tough time on the dating market. If I get to a certain body fat and waist to hip ratio, or shoulder to hip ratio, then I'm good. That may get someone's attention from across the room. And then everything you do from that point forward is what really sets the real stage for ongoing, like, meaningful attraction. So my final point for people who are getting into fitness, and maybe one of their drivers is, I just want to be more confident and feel more attractive and maybe have more, perceived success in dating, is please do not fall into the trap that everyone falls into of saying it's just my body. Because there's like a classic meme that bears repeating in perpetuity. People get into lifting. It's always like a dude in these like meme cartoon things, but it's someone who gets into lifting and they're like, oh man, I'm going to get so much attention from women. And then the next panel is them at a party just talking to all the dudes who are fawning over how big their biceps are. Like, dude, how are you training? How'd you do this? And none of the women they were trying to impress could care in the least that they've added muscle to their arms. So all that is to say, a lot of folks get into lifting and they say, I'm going to get big and muscular and it's going to fundamentally change everything about my dating life. And most people who have been lifting for a long time will tell you that's really just not the case most of the time.
No, you have to get rich instead.
What's that?
You have to get rich instead.
That would be one option, yeah. Or
the rich guy is never very attractive, and he always gets the girl.
You could do the Batman approach and do both.
Sure.
Be the ultra billionaire who's also jacked and lives in a cave. 3 for 3.
So how can we be cool?
Yeah, being cool. This may also help if you're trying to boost your chances out in the dating market. So the signs of being cool, this is from a CNN article. This is a total throwback to what we do in Front Page Fitness. We go to the CNN health page, and for some reason they're talking about what makes a person cool. I don't know why this is on the health page, Lauren. I still, after looking through it, can't wrap my head around it, but they were talking about a study by Pizzuti and colleagues from 2025, and the title of the study is just Cool People, which honestly makes me think these authors are pretty cool. They're not trying too hard with a title. That's what the study's about. So this is from the Journal of Experimental Psychology, and ultimately across almost 6,000 respondents from multiple different cultures: Australia, Chile, China, the mainland and Hong Kong, Germany, India, Mexico, Nigeria, Spain, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, United States. And I'm just reading here, so I don't want to get into jurisdictional disputes about how any of that stuff was phrased. I'm just reading from the thing here. So anyway, they basically were looking at what kind of characteristics were broadly across these many cultures viewed as cool or good. And they said being cool and being good are not the same. So that makes sense. Cool people are perceived to be more extroverted, more hedonistic, more powerful, more adventurous, more open, and more autonomous. So before we get into good people, Lauren, how does that fit your kind of mental model for what a cool person is? Anything that you take issue with? Does that generally check the boxes for you for what a cool person is?
The only one that surprised me was hedonistic.
Yeah, that's true. I could see, of course, you're always thinking like they're outgoing, they capture the room, they have a particular glow about them that people are just attracted to. They're adventurous, they do what they want, they're autonomous, they'll try new things. Hedonistic is, like you said, that's a little bit surprising. Sometimes hedonistic is perceived as a very almost kind of a weakness, so to speak, right? Like you can't resist the temptations that maybe a cool person would say, I don't need all that. Like, I'm good. So yeah, I think hedonistic is an interesting one for sure. But generally speaking, the rest of the others you feel pretty on board with?
I think so. It didn't really talk about interacting with others, right?
This was just kind of, they kind of boiled it down to kind of basic personality traits.
Okay.
So that
Gotcha.
was what they got for cool. Let's talk a little bit about being good, Lauren. So a good person, these are people who are more conforming, more traditional, more secure, more warm, more agreeable, more universalistic, more conscientious, and more calm. How do you feel about that?
Say it again.
Conforming, traditional, secure, warm, agreeable, universalistic, conscientious, and calm.
Secure is the one that surprises me because I would feel like a secure person is cool versus you could take all those other things and say you're insecure and you don't want to stand out from the crowd and therefore you're going to conform and you're going to be agreeable, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd be interested to dive a little deeper and see like how they arrived at that particular trait of secure, like how
Yeah.
necessarily quantified and scored. Because I could see secure, like you said, that was my initial impression, is like if I think of somebody being secure, I think of that person who's just infinitely confident, very assertive, kind of more on the cool side of the equation. But perhaps secure could also take on a meaning of basically, I'm good with what I got. Like I'm cool not being the center of attention. I'm cool with not being, some kind of, alpha who's kind of commanding the room and everything. Like I'm just secure being myself in my own little corner here, and I don't need to be the star of the show. Maybe that's kind of part of what's going into this, but yeah, I just thought it was very fascinating to see how these different personality traits were associated with these different concepts of being cool versus being good. And here's my two-part question, Lauren.
Okay.
Number one, are you cool or are you good?
I think I'm cool.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. I'm stunned by that. I would have really. So do you view yourself as being extrovert?
I do. I mean, I don't like the whole dichotomy of introvert extrovert because I am very extroverted with the people I'm comfortable around. I'm not going to be the person that walks into a room full of strangers and is the center of attention and is really good at small talk. So I think it's extroversion in a different way. But I don't see if in your definition of good, the whole like going with the flow and being cool with whatever and conforming and not pushing back, that none of that is me.
I'd never accuse you of being agreeable. That's for sure. Yeah. Okay. So So you're a cool person. Man, that's wild. Yeah. And so like, let's say, on a scale of like -5 to, or, we'll just arbitrarily -5 to +5. So -5 is cool. +5 is good. Where do you think you would fall on that kind of like numerical spectrum?
So we're saying good is the opposite of cool?
I shouldn't do that. I've created a false dichotomy and then turned it into a spectrum. So we'll just leave it at that. So you identify more with being cool than good. Here's my other question. Part 2 is the people you like to associate with. do you tend to find that you gravitate more just in your social circle? So getting away from all the, like, I'm not talking like the attractiveness and dating side, just people that you say, you know what, I just enjoy spending time with them. I think fondly of them. I like when they're in my corner and around because they're a good hang. Do you tend to find that you associate more with cool people or good people? Or just
I would say
mix?
probably a mix, but I mesh well with someone who's maybe more on the good side, because I think when you get two people who are who are going to butt heads, that then it doesn't work. So you need to have one person who's going to be like, no, let's do this, I don't want to do that, and the other person that's going to say, okay, that's fine, and they're genuinely fine with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I do want to reiterate here that creating these as a dichotomy is not valid. It's not an accurate way to do it. So that's not what I mean to reinforce here. But I do think of these two categories. It's interesting to kind of lay out, where you tend to fall more, and then who you tend to kind of fill more of your social circle with. I would say that I'm actually I would consider myself the opposite.
I would too.
Yeah, I definitely I'm far from the cool category, so I definitely feel like I slot more in with the good. But then when I socialize with people, I do tend to find that there's you got to have at least like the one or two cool people in the mix as it pertains to these traits.
Otherwise, it's a boring hang.
Yeah, what could be worse than a bunch of agreeable people and no one wants to say, like, here's what we're doing and why, It's just horrible. So
I do like that they frame them both as positive.
yeah, I like that as well. Yeah, I think it takes all sorts of personality types to make the world work. And whether you're talking about big organizational units, small organizational units, social circles, whatever, you can't have too many people that want to be the star of the show, too many people that are overly assertive, too many people that are just fundamentally way too agreeable. So yeah, it's nice to have a mixture of different personality types. And Lauren, that brings us to our final topic for the night, which is another thing I found on CNN about matching workouts to your personality type. Okay, so this was a CNN article about a study by Flaminia Ronca and colleagues. And the study was called Personality Traits Can Predict Which Exercise Intensities We Enjoy Most and the Magnitude of Stress Reduction Experienced Following a Training Program. I think that's the title of the study. That's in my notes, so we'll go with it. But basically, what they were trying to do in the study was figure out if personality characteristics can predict physical fitness, enjoyment of exercise by intensity, and engagement in an exercise program in the general population. And generally speaking, I will read their results, what they found here. Personality traits were strong predictors of baseline fitness levels and of enjoyment of different exercise intensities. For example, conscientiousness predicted greater general fitness and more weekly hours of physical activity, whereas extroversion and neuroticism predicted higher VO2 peak and poorer heart rate recovery, respectively. Extroversion also predicted greater enjoyment of highest intensity activities, whereas neuroticism predicted lower enjoyment of activities which required sustained effort. Importantly, those who scored high on neuroticism benefited the most from the potential stress-reducing effects of aerobic training. So they found that, generally speaking, people who were more conscientious were, kind of sticking to it, doing their exercise, frankly, whether they enjoyed it all that much or not. They found that people who were extroverted wanted to just grip it and rip it. They were good with the higher intensity stuff. And people who scored higher on neuroticism scales weren't necessarily all that into the really effortful high intensity stuff. They preferred some lower intensity stuff and things where you could kind of take a break here and there. Generally speaking, I think they found that people with more neuroticism also preferred kind of exercising a little bit out of the spotlight, so people who were high on extroversion were like, yeah, let's do a big old game of like basketball or flag football, or let's all get out there and be active and have it high intensity and, get all amped up. And people who were more on who scored higher with neuroticism traits were a little bit more like, I'm going to go ahead and like do a walk jog on my own, or, maybe go on a long hike in the woods, so to speak. And of course I'm extrapolating and kind of riffing on it, but that was generally what they found in terms of this mix of how different personality traits associated with different types of engagement in exercise. But the really interesting thing was that the people who scored higher on neuroticism, even if they were a little bit less into some of the more social aspects of exercise and the higher intensity stuff, it did seem like they benefited a lot from just engaging in whatever form of exercises that they felt most comfortable doing, and got a lot of stress reduction out of that. And a lot of times stress levels tend to be relatively high among people who have kind of trait level high neuroticism score. So as an esteemed colleague of the Mass crew who also has a degree in psychology, Lauren, how did those initial results, how do those kind of match what you've observed just being in the fitness world for so long in so many different contexts?
I think it makes sense, but as with all psychology research, there's always room to ask more questions, and you wonder, are we trying to oversimplify something? Because at face value, I think none of that is particularly surprising. But the other thing I think of, especially when we think about adults getting involved in fitness, is, did you grow up playing sports? Because if you grew up playing sports, especially team sports, then there's that level that's not necessarily related to your personality, but during a time of development, you were in a kind of performative space, in a competitive space. And I think that kind of shapes how you view success in fitness and probably comfort doing the thing in front of other people. Whereas if you're somebody who has never really been in that sort of environment, it doesn't even have to be team sports. Anything you could have done, dance or gymnastics or public speaking of some kind, it's something where you're used to being in front of people and you have that kind of confidence boost of having success, having done that earlier in life. I think that probably shifts things a little bit, such that even if you are innately introverted, you kind of have some of that in you, and that fuels into the way you engage with fitness.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, as I was kind of reading through this, I kind of was thinking back to my experience within the team sport context. Cause that was my bread. Like growing up, all I did was team sports, until I got into wrestling, which is like a semi-team sport. I know it's like technically individual during the 6 minutes you're on the mat, but like you're grappling with the guys. I mean, 12 hours a week, like it's a team sport. But I thought back to, growing up with playing basketball and baseball and football, and there were so many different personality types within a team. But at the end of the day, we were all under the same lights playing the same game, and it was really interesting to see how different people would make that work. Some people really were kind of the like, I just want to put my head down, be quiet, be a grinder. They could still be just an absolute workhorse, super major contributor to the team, absolutely instrumental. But they found a way to kind of say, I'm going to engage in these team workouts in a way that's under the radar. I'm just going to put my head down and chip away. And then you'd have the more demonstrative folks on the team who, in the weight room, were very emotive, very loud, and we're really into the kind of theatrics of a hard workout. And then the same thing would go with just the general leadership roles that people assume within a team sport context. There would be a lot of folks who would have that kind of unique quality where they led without saying a word. Like people, because we knew that they were dependable, reliable, extremely hard workers, extremely disciplined, and ultimately high performers, they didn't need to say much. But in that rare instance where they actually said like 3 words, in kind of a leadership context, you'd be like, oh God, like they are not happy, or like, wow, they are stoked if they had that kind of react. So it was really interesting in team sports to see how, at the end of the day, everyone's doing the same workouts. You have to make it work. You have to be able to thrive in that environment and get the work done. You have to be able to perform in these, what at the time, when you're a high school athlete, feels like the biggest stage on the planet. Then you get older and you're like, wow, no one cared what we were doing. But still, you felt like you were under the spotlight in a big way. And, Ohio playing football, there'd be thousands of people there. It wasn't the Super Bowl, but it still felt big to you as a kid. And ultimately, that's what kind of dictates the kind of pressure that's perceived in that athletic context. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to see, like, we can, like you said, try to oversimplify it and turn it into these different categorizations and put them into neat little bins. But when you get into practice, you do see that people still find a way to make it work despite dramatically different personality types, leadership styles, things like that. However, Lauren, I would say that as a fitness professional, we don't look at this kind of research for universal truths. If you want universally true findings, you might want to open up like an engineering journal. If you really need that level of certainty in terms of if this is built this way, here's the pressure it can withstand. But when it comes to this kind of squishy stuff, psychology and personality types and how a person might kind of react to certain scenarios, it can still be informative to kind of calibrate your basic expectation level, knowing that there will be exceptions and deviations and gray areas. So, for example, as a coach, I think it could potentially be useful to use this type of research. And as you're doing onboarding with a client and getting to understand their personality type, you might be able to imagine different scenarios where they're more likely to thrive and really, hit the ground running as you start working together in that coach-client relationship. And you could also imagine a scenario where if you put someone in a pretty unfavorable setting, especially if they're new to exercise, theoretically that could potentially backfire. And so maybe this information could at least be helpful in that context. And maybe you're thinking, well, I'm a member of the Iron Cult, but I'm not a coach. Well, realistically, if you're into fitness, there are going to be people in your life who reach out to you as the fitness person they know, right? It's going to be your cousin, your uncle, whoever. And so in those scenarios, that's where I think a lot of people have the most potential to really help people out and kind of help them catch the fitness bug and really initiate a journey in exercise and fitness that, hopefully can really blossom. And I think this is the kind of thing where it can be useful as a very basic, broad heuristic of when you get to know somebody and their personality type and they're saying, I want to engage in exercise. It might be worthwhile to think about their personality type and say, okay, I know this person is really social, ultra extroverted. Maybe if we're trying to get them involved with something that'll capture their interest and they can really enjoy the social aspect and the exercise aspect will just kind of be a pleasant, fringe benefit. Maybe we do put them in a group exercise setting or a recreational team sports setting to kind of kickstart that engagement in fitness. Whereas if someone is extremely introverted, maybe really high on like neuroticism traits and qualities, maybe you start to say, well, let's think of a way that we can kind of help them ease into fitness in a way that is a little bit more flexible. Maybe they might gravitate toward lower intensity stuff where there's some ability to interject with some breaks or alter the intensity as they're going. So you can kind of think through their personality type and maybe use that to guide matching in a tentative way and then, kind of see how it goes from there. Do you think that's a reasonably fair interpretation as the chief head psychologist of the Mass Crew?
Yeah, but I think you could probably gauge all of that just from going back and forth and saying, does a group fitness class sound fun? Like, yeah. Are you up to trying to go into the weight room, or does that sound terrifying? And should we start with some adjustable dumbbells at home and a YouTube video? And I think the person is likely to give you the type of feedback where we don't need to make it more complicated than that, at least initially, right? Because whatever they're up for, initially is what they should do, and then we can progress from there. But I think one of the mistakes that we make as fitness enthusiasts is to try to make everyone do it like us.
Yeah, for sure. And as you were saying that, it also made me think of, one of the factors that I would imagine is a major interacting variable, which is almost certainly self-efficacy, right? So you could have someone who says, yeah, I'm super extroverted, really like social settings, really like to be, the center of attention and kind of, make my presence known. However, what you're asking me to do in this group setting is something I'm not confident in. And I really don't believe in my ability to perform that task at a high level. And a major element of my extroversion in social settings is I like to be out there thriving. I only like the attention when I feel like, hey, I'm really doing something out here. And so you might find that someone is really uncomfortable in scenarios where they are, even though they generally are extroverted, you're asking them to perform a task that they're not confident with yet in a group setting, which could really thwart some of their confidence and ultimately backfire. So yeah, it's definitely, to the extent you can lean on this as a starting point for the conversation, it can only really be viewed as a very loose heuristic. And then, like you said, Lauren, I think the more you talk with someone, this might give you some ideas about what might be the first couple things you bring up in that conversation, but you have to have that conversation and figure out, do you feel up for this? Are you lukewarm about it or enthusiastic about it? And that can ultimately help out with some of that activity matching. And it's especially like, this is something I used to think about a lot. Back when I was in grad school, we would teach physical activity courses, and it was at a university where it was, you had to take a physical activity course to graduate, like mandatory. And so one of the things we had to constantly be very proactive about is there are people at this large university who are not into exercising, especially not in a group setting, and classes are groups. And so we had to be really cognizant about making sure that there were offerings available for people and letting them know what those were that would work for different kind of personality types and different kind of confidence levels with being active in a group setting. And so like there were some people where, I love teaching this course. It was team sports. And so we would get out there, we'd spend like, I believe we would do like 5 weeks playing ultimate frisbee, 5 weeks playing soccer, and 5 weeks playing flag football. And it was awesome. Like people, when they signed up for that class, they knew what they were signing up for. They had so much fun. And frankly, I had a lot of fun teaching it too. That was awesome. And so that was like the people who are high extroversion, love being out there, keeping score, doing the team sport thing. They loved it. And then I also at one point taught I was a substitute teacher for a summer course, which tends to have smaller course loads, and it was like a walking, like physical activity course, so we would do a lot of different walks around campus and things like that. And so you could kind of see how people, like you were saying, Lauren, partially based on their personality type, but also based very much on their comfort level, they would kind of select into, do I want to take this in the fall when there's going to be 25 kids in the class, or in the summer when there's going to be 7? And do I want to do the high intensity social team activity, or do I want to do the more kind of solo, go on a campus walk kind of thing? So, it's interesting stuff to think about when you're helping guide people through fitness, and ultimately if you're coaching people. I think it's really important to make sure that you're being creative and very thoughtful in terms of how you're matching clients with different ways to engage with fitness. Because Lauren, believe it or not everyone, we're not even going to let Helms, I might clip this from the episode. Not everyone wants to be a bodybuilder or a power lifter. Can you even believe it, Lauren?
No, I mean, he'll be devastated to hear that.
Yeah. And I know what he'll say. He'll say, well, yeah, of course, there's Olympic weightlifters. Obviously. So, all right.
Strong men as well.
Yes. Yeah, strong men, of course. Yeah, there's all sorts of folks out there. Different strokes for different folks. Yeah. So, all right, Lauren. So I appreciate you being a guest on Iron Culture. I tried to make you feel at home by giving it more of a front page fitness vibe. Listeners, dear listeners, if you enjoyed there's a general type of content where, we maybe look at a handful of studies in an episode or a few studies in an episode, look at some lay press articles, kind of chat through the science behind it, and also kind of real world experience and perspectives. If you like that, you may indeed like Front Page Fitness, and you should check it out. And I will try my best to remember to link it in the show notes, but you can find it anywhere that you find Iron Culture. If you hated it and you said, I wanted 90 minutes of hard-hitting focus on a very in-depth meta-analysis, Lauren, is it fair to say that perhaps Front Page Fitness might not be for them?
But listen to it anyway, because, why not?
What I would suggest, if that's you and you're not interested in Front Page Fitness, is go ahead and subscribe. Just subscribe, put it on automatic downloads,
5-star review. Why not?
Give it a 5-star review. What do you care? You have nothing to lose in this. You don't have to listen to it just because it shows up in your Spotify feed. So if you consider yourself either a good person or a cool person, in either case, this does you no harm. It means the world to Lauren. And who doesn't want to appease a cool person like Lauren at the end of the day? All right, folks, that does it for this episode of Iron Culture. Thanks, as always, for listening, and we will be back with another episode in 1 week.